clearly he was a sexual adventurer, obsessed with women.
And he felt angry, guilty, weird.
They're horrified. They've never seen such a scene.
If I was standing in front of a jury, I would have no problem arguing that case.
Turns to me and he says, "You know, Bill, for the first time, I really hate the swarthy man."
On the right, down there, is Norton, 39th and Norton, where the Black Dahlia was found. I know who killed the Black Dahlia.
(1947). 2 years had passed since the end of the war, and President Harry Truman's declaration that the United States was now the most powerful country in the world. This was the triumphant America of the refrigerator, of Technicolor, of ever bigger automobiles, the breaking of the sound barrier, Bogart and Bacall, and of the Marshall Plan. But it was also the America of easy cash and police corruption, especially in the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department. One winter morning in 1947, 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, a drifting starlet, was found murdered. A journalist dubbed her the Black Dahlia because of her jet black hair. It was one of the most appalling crimes ever committed in America. The nation's newspapers breathlessly followed the ups and downs of an investigation involving more than 250 officers. Dozens of suspects were questioned, but the murderer who had terrified and fascinated America was never found. In his novel, The Black Dahlia, James Ellroy wove an impressive portrait of Hollywood in the 40s, and he imagined a solution to this crime. As fanciful as Ellroy's version was, it would be surpassed by the reality.
My name is Steve Hodel. I'm retired LAPD homicide detective. I worked the mean streets here in Hollywood for 24 years. Tonight we're going to go on an amazing adventure.
Steve Hodel joined the LAPD in 1963. He spent 5 years as a patrolman in the Wilshire, Van Nuys and Hollywood districts. In 1969, Steve Hodel joined the Police Inspectors Department and by 1983 had risen to the highest grade, Grade 3. He was named Chief of Homicide Inspectors in 1986. During his brilliant career at LAPD, Steve Hodel handled nearly 300 murder cases. On Monday, May the 17th, 1999, Steve Hodel received a call. It was 1 a.m. He learned that his father, Dr. George Hodel, had just died of a heart attack in San Francisco at the age of 92. As he traveled to San Francisco, he recalled the father he'd barely known, the young legal columnist, the meticulous surgeon, the dominating psychiatrist, and also the business wizard who'd abandoned his wife and children, leaving the country in 1950. This incredible man who'd lived 4 successive lives was George Hill Hodel. In San Francisco, Dr. Hodel's widow June, his 4th wife, gave Steve Hodel a keepsake, a photo album that had belonged to his father. Steve Hodel's life was about to be turned upside down.
I looked at it and I knew I'd seen the face, but I wasn't sure from where. Full 22-year-old young woman in the book, I turned to June and I said, "June, who is this? Why does she look so familiar?" And she said, "I don't know, it's somebody your father knew from a long time ago." And I searched my memory, and deep within came Black Dahlia, the name Black Dahlia. I recognized the diamond-shaped face, the high forehead, the dark hair. I made comparisons to pictures from the time and discovered, in fact, it was Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. And interesting, what is a picture of Elizabeth Short doing in my father's album? To understand this story and this investigation, you have to understand my father, Dr. George Hill Hodel. My father was born in Los Angeles in 1907. At the age of 7, he was a child prodigy playing his own piano concerts in the Shrine Auditorium. Became a cab driver in Los Angeles, passing himself off at 16 as 21. 186 IQ, 1 point above Einstein. He would graduate from medical school with honors, highly skilled in surgery. All of this you need to know as background to understand the full story of the Black Dahlia.
Steve Hodel claims that he uses thought prints. According to him, our thoughts link us to our acts. Hidden behind each of our thoughts is a goal, a motive. We leave traces of ourselves in each of our acts. Like fingerprints, these traces are identifiable. Steve Hodel calls them thought prints. But like scattered pieces of a puzzle, they don't make any sense until they're regrouped to form a clear image of the facts. In 1945, Dr. Hodel bought the famous Sade house on Franklin Avenue in the center of Hollywood that had been built by the son of the great architect Frank Lloyd Wright. This strange building, classed as a historic monument, is architecturally most unusual. With its stone vaults, long hallways and huge courtyard, the big swimming pool in the middle, and its hidden rooms, it could be a set from a Hollywood movie of the 30s. And its high walls make it an impenetrable fortress in the heart of one of the most exclusive residential neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Steve Hodel spent 5 years of his childhood there from the ages of 4 to 9. To him, this incredible house, known to everyone as the Franklin House, was like something out of the Arabian Nights. For others, it was the house of horror. Rereading the newspapers of the time and recalling his childhood, innumerable thought prints began to surge up in Steve Hodel's mind, and they pointed the finger of accusation at his father.
Clearly, he was a sexual adventurer, obsessed with women.
You have to understand that my father was a classical pure sadist. Man Ray, John Huston, George Hodel, all were sadists. They all worshipped the Marquis de Sade and his works. Women were for their pleasure. They were objects to be treated as such.
We know that he had these sex parties with Man Ray, John Huston, were all exploiters of women, users of women.
The name of sculptor Fred Sexton must be added to this evil trio. Sexton, John Huston's high school classmate, made the famous statuette of the Maltese falcon.
Tamar ran away from home at 14, was picked up by the police, and disclosed that she'd been having sexual relations with her father.
I don't know what happened, but I was taking off my clothes, or my clothes were being taken off, and Fred Sexton was attempting to have sex with me. And that made George very angry. And he kicked him out of the room. I mean, I was in shock, everything that was going on. I can't explain to you what happened, other than that my consciousness left my body for a moment. Then my father had sex with me, and he felt angry, guilty, weird. And then I left the room, and it was maybe 5 in the morning by this time. And that never happened again. But I became pregnant.
She became pregnant. Dad had to get an abortion for her. It was all arranged. Within hours, there's a knock at the door, and it's LAPD detectives saying, "Dr. George Hodel, you're under arrest for incest." And it was headlines, and of course, Dad got the best attorney in town, Jerry Giesler, who was kind of the Johnny Cochran of his day. They had a 3-week jury trial, and he was acquitted. And the reason he was acquitted basically was they paraded 12 witnesses saying that Tamara was not to be believed. She was a pathological liar. She had fantasies, and the jury bought it. Dad immediately fled the country and left for Hawaii and Asia for the next 40 years. Under that cover, actually, we would discover the real reason was much darker, and it related to the Black Dahlia investigation.
The sordid story of his half-sister's rape was what put Steve Hodel on the trail of his father's true personality. Elizabeth Short, born July the 29th, 1924. Brought up on the East Coast, she came to California to seek love, but death was waiting for her there. In 1943, she got a job on a military base. Elizabeth fell in love with a Flying Tigers pilot and planned to marry him, but he was killed on a mission. After a round trip to Massachusetts, she was back in Hollywood in 1946, where she lived a dissolute life for several months. At dawn on January 15, 1947, a limousine crossed Los Angeles driving toward Norton and 39th. The murderer had just disposed of the body of Elizabeth Short.
So now, this is the Leimert Park part of Los Angeles. We're about 6-7 miles south of Hollywood. You can see the Hollywood sign in the distance. On a cold morning, January 15th, 1947, a young woman was walking with her daughter, 3-year-old daughter, down the sidewalk here. This was just a vacant lot. They look over and they see here, approximately this position just off the sidewalk, they see this body that's carefully posed with the arms above, spread out. To their horror, they discover it's a woman. They run south about a block, knock on a door, call the police. Veteran homicide detectives get out here, examine it. They find this Jane Doe. They're horrified. They've never seen such a scene, cut, brutalized, tortured, and bisected in half. The investigation begins at that point. About an hour earlier, a witness was about a half a block to the north, and they looked down and they saw a black car, which they described as a 1936 or 37 sedan, possibly a Ford. They weren't sure of the model and make. Drive up, stop for about 3 minutes at the sidewalk near the body, where the body was posed. It then turned and drove north. About 3 miles north of here, between the Franklin house and Hollywood, my dad's home, her purse and her shoes were found. So the car stopped, left the evidence there, and then drove off. My father at that time owned a 1936 Packard. It's very similar to a Ford. The comparison is quite striking. So everything fits in regards to the vehicle description too.
Elizabeth Short was not killed at the scene. I believe she was killed in a bathtub, probably at the Franklin house, because her body was drained of blood. There was no blood left. The head of the local FBI office saying that he had examined the body, and there is no way that a non-surgeon could have done the bisection, because it was a very clean bisection. So whoever did that, and I believe that Dr. Hodel did it, and Dr. Hodel had an excellent reputation as a surgeon when he was in medical school. He was sought after to help out in surgeries because he was so good.
Basically, the crime scene explains a sadist's works. My father carefully posed Elizabeth Short at the crime scene with her arms above her head, surgically bisected at the waist, to replicate one of Man Ray's most famous photographs, the Minotaur, which is a woman bisected in half, savagely and carefully posed.
Man Ray, one of the leading figures of surrealism, began drawing and painting at the age of 20. From 1945 to 1949, Man Ray was present at all the Southern house parties, where cocktails, loose women, and cocaine were plentiful. Man Ray's influence on George Hodel is undeniable. In spite of all his professional success, at heart, George Hodel dreamed of being an artist.
She was posed for a reason, and I have never heard a better explanation than Steve's explanation about how his dad was such a good friend and follower of Man Ray.
Another photograph, The Lovers, by Man Ray, is very famous, where you see these pair of lips floating over the horizon. He actually cut the mouth ear to ear almost in this careful replication of it.
Whether Dr. Hodel was trying to impress Man Ray by killing Elizabeth Short and posing her to look like two of Man Ray's photographs, I think, yes, that's true. There's some interesting things in his background. Steve's mother said that Dr. Hodel had a lust for blood. And he also told one of his girlfriends that whenever he smoked hashish, that she should lock him in the bathroom because sometimes he said, "I do terrible things." He liked publicity, and he liked the fact that there were headlines about the Black Dahlia murder, but after a week or so, the headlines started dying down, and so he called the city editor, Mr. Richardson, and he said, "Well, I see that you're kind of losing steam on this case. Maybe I can send you something that'll help you out a little bit." And lo and behold, Mr. Richardson gets a package, and it has Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her Social Security card, personal identification, an address book that had 75 names in it with one page torn out. And what he did after the murders is he would send postcards and notes to either the Los Angeles Examiner or the Los Angeles Herald Express. And some of the notes were even like headlines. A headline writer for the newspaper would write. Steve Hodel did a smart thing in this case. He hired an independent handwriting expert, somebody he didn't know, somebody that didn't know anything about the case. He never told Hannah McFarlane, the expert, that this was the Black Dahlia case or that his father was the suspect.
She was just analyzing the known samples of my father's handwriting against the samples sent in by the Black Dahlia Avenger. What's interesting in this case is that the graphology was done by two world-recognized experts back in 1947. They came back with the same profile as today's expert came back on that. Highly intelligent, cunning, disguising himself, feigning to be an ignorant person, but in fact extremely intelligent.
Somebody familiar, like a child being familiar with their parents' handprinting, or a handwriting expert, they're going to be able to see through the disguise.
She positively found in 4 or 5 of these notes they were definitely written by the same individual, which was George Hodel. No handwriting expert has come forward and said these were not written by George Hodel. It's been 3 years now, and nobody's come forward and made that statement. A lot of the things fell into place as they did 50 years ago.
Contrary to Steve Hodel's claims, some experts do not agree with this interpretation of the handwriting. At the end of March 1950, Dr. George Hodel quit his job, abandoned his wife and children, and left America for Hawaii and then Asia. He knocked about there until settling in Manila in the Philippines. He would not set foot in the United States for more than half a century.
Oh, I think that Dr. Hodel left the country because he was afraid of the DA's office, because he knew that the DA's office was zeroing in on him.
We now know that he was the prime suspect in the Black Dahlia investigation. The DA's office had surveilled their Franklin house. They had transcripts, secret recordings, and in fact, he was about to be arrested for the crime.
Remember, Dr. Hodel thought his phone was tapped. So he was very careful what he said on the phone, but he could not conceive that they had actually planted a bug in his house.
The statement that Dr. Hodel made to the German man that he was talking to, and this was not over the phone. The German man was present in the room with him at Dr. Hodel's house, and Dr. Hodel said, supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. Now, can you imagine an innocent person making a statement like that? That is a statement of a guilty man.
And then on another tape, you have a woman screaming. I mean, don't forget, she had picked up the phone. This is all documented on the tape. The woman picked up the phone, tried to call the police. That was cut short. A couple minutes later, she's screaming. Then there's sounds of digging. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that something really evil was happening down in that cellar.
Literally, they're sitting there with the microphones hidden in the walls, tape recording, and Dad is contacted by somebody on the inside and said, "You got to get out of Dodge." He takes off and is in the wind. They are not sure where. So basically, it turns out that they discover that he's probably in Asia, or they're not sure, maybe Mexico. And they pull out the microphones, and basically the powers that be order it shut down and closed out.
At every level of city government, one word reigned in post-war Los Angeles: corruption.
There's a lot of speculation on why Dr. Hodel wasn't arrested.
My father was the head of LA County Health Department VD control. That meant he was treating all of the high officers in LAPD for their indiscretions, as well as film people. He was very well connected, and of course he had very sensitive files on many important people. In addition to that, we learned that there was an abortion ring going on where LAPD officers were receiving large payments of monies from doctors who were in a protected ring. Basically, the medical doctors, would pay $500 or $1,000 a month and not have to worry about getting arrested. Abortion was a felony, and you could go to state prison back then. Of course, Dad knew all of this. He knew all of the players and everything else.
The abortion ring is a key to understanding this whole case, because the abortion ring is what gave Dr. Hodel his leverage and his influence over the top cops, the top politicians, and it explains why once they realized who the killer was, why they didn't just arrest him right there on the spot. He had too much information on their wives, their girlfriends, their secret abortions, and all the nasty sexual things that went on behind the scenes. And Dr. Hodel was one of the people who facilitated that dark life.
And that was one of the reasons why they didn't pursue him and attempt to bring him back from Asia. He fled the country. They weren't even sure they could get him back. If they were to expose all of this, of course it would bring down LAPD at the time.
The 40s were a very different time period than we're living in today. There was a lot of corruption in the police department, in city government.
And you have to understand that LAPD at that time was a real-life LA Confidential. Half the department was corrupt. They were committing everything from murders to huge thefts. They were receiving payoffs, political connections. So all of this you have to put in perspective of the history of the time.
Once again, reality surpasses even James Ellroy's darkest fiction. As in his novel LA Confidential, the post-war LAPD is completely corrupt. Thad Brown and William Parker are both campaigning for the job of police chief. Neither can publicly acknowledge that police inspectors accept bribes to protect an abortion network, and that, even worse, they've covered up the most horrible murder ever committed in Los Angeles.
That was the Dahlia-gate. The reason was LAPD, the powers that be, Chief Parker and Chief Thad Brown of detectives, wanted to turn things around.
I believe that there was a cover-up, and again, that's why the LAPD has trouble accepting this, because to accept that Dr. Hodel did it is to accept that there was a major cover-up by Chief Parker and Thad Brown in 1950, and that's difficult for them to swallow.
He was out of the country. It was questionable as to they could even get him back. They just said, let's put a lid on it for the good of the department, for the good of the city, and for the good of Los Angeles.
They opted for self-preservation and the preservation of the department. You have to, again, look at the context. The LAPD had been through a series of corruption scandals, purges. The feeling was, one more major scandal and this department is done.
There's just one solution: to hush it up. The orders are issued. All the records of the Black Dahlia case are to be hidden or destroyed.
Samples that they could have taken DNA from have disappeared. Even the fingerprints of Dr. Hodel when he was arrested for the incest case against his daughter Tamar, those have disappeared. So there are no fingerprints to compare with the fingerprints that were recovered from the crime scene.
The police are unable to deal with the consequences of admitting that it's been solved. Over the years, they gradually got rid of all the evidence, anticipating that there might someday come a situation where people would want to reopen it. In the case someone like Steve Hodel ever did come along. I mean, you know, they didn't know it would be Steve, but there's always a possibility that someone's going to come out of the woodwork.
It's shocking that all of this evidence was lost on. This is Los Angeles' most famous unsolved murder case. Let somebody rifle through the files and take the evidence is unconscionable.
And now I understand that all the coroner's evidence has also disappeared. All right, call me a conspiracy theorist, but it's just too much of a coincidence. I know this is shocking, but cops do those kind of things occasionally. Not always. Most cops are good cops. But I think in this case, loyalty to the department took precedence over loyalty to the truth.
By deliberately obstructing justice, Steve Hodel believes that these two senior police officers are directly responsible for letting a psychopathic murderer remain at large.
Well, actually, this was confirmed officially after my book came out in April of '03. The press demanded answers, and basically they came forward. And what LAPD has said is that all of the evidence, all of the original mailings by the Black Dahlia Avenger have disappeared. Everything that was locked up in the evidence lockers has vanished. They have no explanation as to how or why it vanished. So in fact, there's nothing left. There's nothing there are no more secret files. Even the coroner's protocol has disappeared. More importantly, all of the interviews of individuals connected to my father, the tape recordings, the wire recordings, all of that has also vanished. They have no explanation for that.
The LAPD never had even admitted the existence of these wiretapes. It was only when Steve's book came out and the LA Times went to the district attorney's office.
They went to the vault, they unlocked, and they took out the Dahlia file, which had been locked for 50 years. And in a true Geraldo moment, they opened the box, and out falls a photograph of my father, George Hodel. There were over 1,000 pages of documentation, and what we found out was incredible confirmation. George Hodel was, in fact, and had been the prime suspect in the Dahlia murder in February and March of 1950 before he fled the country. Here we have a quote in conversation. Thad Brown was talking to Jack Webb, who's the famous star of Sergeant Joe Friday of Dragnet. And in conversation, Thad Brown told him that the Black Dahlia case was solved. The suspect was a doctor in Hollywood who lived on Franklin Avenue. Well, it's my belief that Thad Brown couldn't resist the photo opportunity. In other words, clearly we know that he knew that George Hodel was the Black Dahlia killer. And the fact that his son, the irony of it, that his son was on the department He just couldn't resist taking the photograph, and he initiated this.
50 years later, here we get proof that Steve was not just fishing around in the dark, was not just making stuff up to get back at his father.
This was all confirmed. They actually wiretapped our Franklin house for 40 days. They had 18 detectives assigned to it around the clock for 24/7, and were about to arrest him, and he fled the country right around the end of March in 1950.
In 1991, Dr. George Hodel, now 84, returned to the United States after an absence of nearly 40 years. He settled in San Francisco with his fourth and last wife, June, where he remained until his death on May 17, 1999.
Well, I think that when he came back to San Francisco, that nobody was working on the Black Dahlia case. Certainly nobody from LAPD was. The current head investigator, Brian Carr, when Steve Hodel asked him about what was in the file, and if the name Dr. George Hodel was in the file, he was completely unfamiliar with the name Dr. Hodel. Well, we know from the volumes of paperwork that the DA's office gave to LAPD when the DA's office got off the case, that all of that stuff should be in the files, but Steve Hodel believes that the files were sanitized, and of course so much time had passed that the investigators had lost interest in investigating the case. The original investigators retired. Detective Harry Hansen, who was the lead investigator, retired in the early 1970s. And since that time, nothing really has happened on it until Steve Hodel saw his father's miniature scrapbook.
The expression serial killer did not yet exist in the post-war world, and police investigative procedures had no provision for cross-checking the methods of serial killers. However, on February the 10th, 1947, a few weeks after the Black Dahlia murder, the naked body of Jean French was discovered. She'd been beaten, her body lacerated and thrown onto wasteland. The murderer had scrawled obscenities on her body with lipstick. The night before her death, a witness claimed to have seen her having dinner with a man with black hair and a small moustache.
Elizabeth Short was murdered on January 15th, 1947, and less than a month after that, Jean French was murdered on February 10th, 1947. Both Elizabeth Short and Jean French had their faces cut from the mouth, and Jean French went almost to her ears. On Jean French's body, the doctor had written in lipstick, and pardon my language, but this is what was on the body: "Fuck you, B period, D period." Well, B period, D period could only be Black Dahlia. Obviously, Dr. Hodel had a lot of anger directed towards Elizabeth Short because of the amount of torture that he inflicted on her.
There's no logical reason for these kind of murders, and I think she just fell into it. I mean, I really don't know exactly why.
Even when he was killing Jean French, he was still thinking about how much he hated Elizabeth Short. And I can only believe that that's because Elizabeth Short spurned him. And the doctor did not take kindly to anyone telling him no.
According to Steve Hodel, his father's past, his sexual deviancy, and the group of friends with whom he shared an artistic fascination for sadism sheds light on his true personality. But a sexual offender capable of such violence would not be satisfied committing just one murder. Steve Hodel believes that murders like this have to be the work of a serial killer. There could be a link with other unsolved murders of women in Los Angeles between 1943 and 1950. A similar modus operandi, bodies discovered in the same geographic area, and the deliberate policy of the LAPD to refuse to see any link between the murders.
Do I believe in the probability of a serial killer? Of course. No, I'm convinced that Dr. Hodel is not only killed the Black Dahlia, but at least 10 other women, young, single women, attractive women. I think Steve has proved at least 8, and I'm sure that another 10 or 20 even, if he keeps pounding away, he'll prove those too.
If I was standing in front of a jury, I would have no problem arguing that case, and I believe that I would be able to get a conviction on both counts of murder. Now, some of the other murders that Steve brings up, very suspicious, and you think where there's smoke, there's fire, and I know Steve strongly believes that he killed some other women, but I just have always felt that I never had enough on those other cases to bring them into court to prosecute someone on it. I mean, I take the responsibility of prosecuting someone very seriously, and I want to make sure that I really have the evidence before I file charges against somebody and go into court.
All of the murders stopped when he left in 1950. Before that, from 1943 to 1950, when he fled, there were a dozen murders in a very tight geographical pattern between Hollywood and downtown, all around my father's medical office and near our Franklin home. Within a 10-mile radius, there were a dozen murders. They all ceased after.
Murders didn't stop because George Hodel left, but the type of murder that he committed with Elizabeth Short and Jean French, those seemed to stop. There were a whole bunch of young women that were getting murdered around that time period, but unfortunately in Los Angeles there are always lots of murders.
In the latest edition of his book, Steve Hodel claims to have new proof of his father's guilt. But is this proof really convincing? The mystery remains.
This clearly is Elizabeth Short. Many critics have said it's not. They're wrong. Even my good friend James Ellroy didn't believe it was the same woman, but he realized that it didn't matter. All that was it started me down the path. One of the most bizarre findings in my new evidence is this. We see a close-up. I've enlarged the torso, the upper torso, and we see an object here where the arrow marks. And it appears to me to be a man's wristwatch. This is a later photograph at the coroner's office. We see that we see the same location, but the object is missing. It's gone. There's never been any mention of this man's wristwatch. What is particularly interesting here is that Man Ray, in his conversations with Gertrude Stein, a good friend of his, Gertrude always said to him, "You must include time in your composition." I believe my father placed this timepiece, this man's wristwatch, inside the body as part of his surreal creation. At the time, in 1947, a man's wristwatch, a military wristwatch, was found at the crime scene. A week later, on the 21st of January 1947, they sent police recruits from LAPD to walk the vacant lot and search. And what did they find? The search turned up a military-type watch, still unidentified. So we have confirmation that a man's wristwatch was found at the crime scene, but again, no reports, no mention of it.
Fortunately, we have Steve Hodel, who was, he not only was a good homicide investigator when he was with LAPD, he was one of their best investigators. He handled over 300 murder cases, and I work with him and I know the quality of his work, and you know, if he brought in a case and he didn't think he had the evidence, he would tell you right off.
You know, this is a guy who solved over 200 homicides. This is not some guy off the street who says, "Yeah, I think my father did it." He actually loved and revered his father. Had no idea that this father had this terrible, terrible dark side.
So, you know, it's very bizarre that fate turned out to have one of the most brutal murderers in Los Angeles history, to have his son turn out to be a homicide investigator who later on, after he retired, would prove that his father was the murderer of the Black Dahlia. I have no doubt in my mind that George Hodel murdered both Elizabeth Short and Jean French. And were he alive today, and were the witnesses alive, I would have no problem in filing 2 counts of murder against Dr. George Hodel. And I believe if I took that case in front of a jury, that I would convict him.
Over there, straight ahead, where the lights are scarce and dim, is El Monte, not a nice part of town. That's where James Ellroy lived until he was 12. It's also where his mother was found brutally murdered on Saturday, June 21st, 1958. She was raped and horribly strangled.
The early morning of June 22nd, 1958. A stretch of ivy beside a deserted street near a sports ground in El Monte, a seedy, filthy neighborhood of Los Angeles. The body of Geneva Hilliker Ellroy was discovered here. She had been raped and strangled. She was James Ellroy's mother. The murder was never solved. She was a beautiful redhead, divorced with custody of her small son. She tried to make him a secure life, but at the same time she loved men, alcohol, and bars. James would be forever affected by the event. He was only 10 years old at the time. Bill Stoner, a former detective in the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, handled more than 200 cases. He was unaware at the time he retired that he would have to reopen the Geneva Hilliker Ellroy case.
Sheriff's Homicide, Detective Bill Stoner. I'd like to know your whereabouts on June 15th, 1958. I understand you've been seeing a woman by the name of Geneva Ellroy. It all started in 1994. I was about to retire from the Sheriff's Department. I had spent 32 years on the job, my last 15 years as a homicide detective. And my last 7 years I ran the cold case, or the unsolved unit for the Homicide Bureau. And I think it was about 3-4 weeks before I retired, I received a phone call from James Ellroy, and I didn't know who he was. I had never heard of him before, because as a homicide detective, you don't come home and start reading murder novels. You do enough of that on the job, you don't need to come home and do it. So I was not familiar with him when he called.
James Ellroy, the iconic figure of American noir, has pursued 2 shadows, that of his mother, Geneva Hilliker Ellroy, and that of Elizabeth Short, the dead heroine of his book, The Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short has been both the muse and the dark angel of his work. In the 10-year-old James Ellroy's mind, the 2 mysteries, the deaths of his mother and of the Black Dahlia, merged into one confused, superimposed puzzle.
And he explained who he was, and that his mother had been the victim of a homicide in 1958 in the city of El Monte. The case had been investigated by our department, the LA Sheriff's Department, and that the case was still unsolved, and that he was getting ready to write an article for a newspaper, or for a magazine, about her homicide and how it had affected his life. And he wanted to come in and view her file. Normally, we don't allow people to view unsolved files because the cases are still open. There's no statutes or limitation on a homicide. And there may be something in the file that we don't want publicized or in the newspaper. So I told him I'd review the file and call him back, which I did. And there was nothing in there that he shouldn't be able to see. He's the son of the victim. He knew nothing about the facts of her homicide all those years. And he wanted to hire me to reinvestigate her homicide, and that he would go along with me. And he at the time said, it'll probably take us a couple months. And I said, you're looking at least a year of work. It's going to be very difficult, and the probability of solving it is 1 in a million. And he said, I need to do the experience, and I would like you to do this with us. After we got into the investigation, we were into the investigation maybe a month, and I told him, I said, I've contacted our evidence people, and they still have your mother's evidence from her homicide in our warehouse, where they maintain all of the unsolved packages for that type of case. I don't think he was quite prepared for what happened. we sit him down in this viewing room, and they bring in this large package of evidence, and we slowly open it. And the first thing they pull out is the dress that she was wearing. And James looks at it and he says, you know, I remember this dress really well. He just became quite emotional at that point. Not crying, but quite shaken, I think, by what he was experiencing. And the next thing we pulled out was the ligature that was used to strangle her with. And he again picked it up in his hands and was just very silent. And when we got done looking at the various pieces of evidence, we walked out to the parking lot, and we had driven our own cars, and he said, you know, I just need some time alone. And he got in his car and went back to the hotel that he was staying at, but later told me that he spent a very emotional evening that evening. I began to see a change in James. When we first started this thing, James talked very poorly about his mother. I think the one moment that really identified that occurring, we had gone back to Wisconsin to interview some of her family, and they gave him some photographs of her as a young woman. In fact, many of those are in the book. I think there's one of her sitting in a riding habit, sitting on a fence at a ranch. A very beautiful photograph. And he's viewing these photographs, and he turns to me, and he says, you know, Bill, for the first time, I really hate the swarthy men.
Witnesses describe a man accompanying Geneva Hilliker Ellroy during her last hours. A man of Italian or Greek descent, 35 to 40 years old, thin face, dark skin, black hair, cut short on the sides and brushed towards the back. These features are strangely reminiscent of Fred Sexton, Dr. Hodell's henchman. For Steve Hodell, the composite sketches made by the police could indeed be Fred Sexton.
I think there's a possibility, and of course I introduced this in my book, that James Ellroy's mother could have been killed by an associate, my close Fred Sexton, the accomplice in some of the murders that my father was involved in. It's something that definitely should be looked at, but I'm not going as far as to say that he actually committed the crime.
I think Fred Sexton probably did it, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt.
There is clearly not enough evidence for me on any of the cases to prove that Fred Sexton was one of the killers.
So I think there's actually less chance of closing that case than there is of closing the Elizabeth Short case.
You know, I read Mr. Hodell's book, and you know, he's got some very strong circumstantial evidence pointing to his father as the suspect in the book. I understand he's come up with some more information since he's written the book that is even more defining as his father as the killer of Elizabeth Short. I don't know. When I read the book, I felt, yeah, he's very possibly right that his father was the killer, but it's possible that his father wasn't the killer. It wasn't so defining that I would go to court on it at that point. But as far as his father's friend being involved in James's mother's murder, you know, I don't think so. I think, as James thinks, I think she went out on a date that night, and whoever this person was got angry with her and ended up raping her and killing her. And I think it was just that type of case. I don't think so, but you know, I don't have any evidence to prove it one way or the other.
Only its legendary status kept the Black Dahlia case open after so many years. Today, James Ellroy is weary of killers. For him, the relationship between creation and violence is a false one. The aestheticism of the serial killer bores him. He stated that, after the Black Dahlia, My Dark Places is the last book I intend to write about crime in Los Angeles. After having confronted the memory of his mother, and after having found her in his book, Ellroy published a trilogy about modern America. James Ellroy has closed the door on his black side, his dark places. And what are we to make of Steve Hodell? Is he a retired cop acting like a writer? Or a businessman clever enough to get the Los Angeles Times involved in his literary endeavor, helping him to sell 450,000 books? Or is he a man still in search of the father who abandoned him as a child, doing his psychoanalysis in public? Ellroy, Hodel, two men digging into their parents' past. One laid his mother to rest, the other brought a monster to life. The Black Dahlia, halfway between an Oedipal tragedy and a gory crime yarn, is darker than the most terrifying fiction. By becoming a myth, this case has definitively slipped through the mesh that separates imagination from reality.